introduce the moderator for this panel, which is not me. It's Philippa Strum, and I apologize for not putting her name on the program. Philippa was my predecessor as Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center, and she has very large, very small feet. So large shoes, small feet and large shoes to fill, and I've done my best to fill them. But she is herself an author, a political scientist, and an author of many important books, most recently a book called Mendez v. Westminster, which was about one of the first cases of educational civil rights, in this case involving Mexican Americans, which preceded Brown v. Board of Education. And we had the privilege of launching that book last week. But now Flip has kindly agreed to moderate this panel, and she will now do so.
Thank you, Sonia. Good afternoon, everybody. What I had planned to do is introduce everybody with a few sentences, because while you all have biographies, people who are watching on the webcast don't, and I will do that eventually. But we're very fortunate to have with us today Sarah Manzano-Diaz, who's the director of the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, and who has the panache of being unanimously confirmed just this past February. Think of today's Congress. She was unanimously confirmed. This is remarkable.
Thank you.
And she was previously Deputy Secretary of State for Regulatory Programs in Pennsylvania. This is her second appearance at the Wilson Center since she came to Washington for this job, and we're feeling very fortunate indeed that she is in Washington, because we hope you'll come back very frequently. However, she has to leave quickly, and therefore what we're going to do is we're going to listen to her remarks, which are going to focus very importantly on the homelessness of women veterans, and looking at the question of what happens to veterans who don't have families or who feel disconnected from their families. And she'll take a couple of questions before she has to zip out, and then I will introduce the other members of the panel and we'll hear their remarks. So, please, the podium is yours, Mrs. Manzano-Diaz.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. How are you this afternoon? Mm-hmm. All right? Good. That's what I want to hear. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Michelle so much for your kind introduction, and also thank you all for the kind invitation to be here. I'm very excited to be here, actually. I would like to start my remarks actually by reading an article that was in the newspaper that I think illustrates why one of my 4 priorities as the head of the Women's Bureau is homeless women vets. Laurie Elmer, a 47-year-old mother of 4, shuns crowds and strangers. She always sits facing the restaurant door when she goes out to eat. And before sitting down, she makes sure to identify the quickest route out. Elmer is a military Army sergeant and is among 250,000 women who have served the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, according to the Defense Department. But the numbers that speaks to her life-changing experience is $50 million, the amount that was spent last year by the VA in compensating all female veterans from the War on Terror for psychological damage, according to the Chicago Tribune. A medic in the Army's 82 Airborne Division, Elmer waited 20 years to get an overseas combat assignment. Within months of arriving in Afghanistan, her career as a skilled medic began to unravel. Ms. Elmer reported being raped by a coalition officer in Kandahar province in the spring of 2003. In a separate incident, she injured her head falling off the military vehicle. Today, the combination of post-traumatic stress, trauma, brain injury, has enveloped her life in a light fog marked by physical imbalance, disorientation, anxiety, and around-the-clock headache. As a result of her injuries, Elmer is a higher risk of stroke and early onset of Alzheimer's disease. The ultimate cost of her maladies is unknown. Last year, mental illness accounted for 35% of the $22 billion spent on disability payments to the veterans who served in all the wars from Vietnam forward. And lastly, the Chicago Tribune's analysis of the claims recorded for the Department of Veterans Affairs found that the vets' psychological wounds are far more expensive than any other type of disability. The reason why I read that to you is because that's the reason why one of my priorities is homeless women vets. Our administration, the Obama administration, last fall, God bless you, launched, the president signed an executive order establishing the Veterans Employment Initiative for the executive branch, joined by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as the OPM director. The executive order was created, the same executive order created the Interagency Council on Veterans Employment, which will advise the president and the director of OPM on the Veterans Employment Initiative. Secretary Solis, who is my secretary at the Department of Labor, chairs the Interagency Council on Veterans Employment. Her vision for 2010 and beyond is good jobs for everyone, but in this case, we're talking about in particular to homeless women vets. The Women's Bureau is now celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. It was created in 1920, 3 months before the women got the right to vote. And my 4 priorities for the Women's Bureau is pay equity, work-life balance, promoting good jobs, higher paying jobs for women, such as green jobs, non-traditional jobs, and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. But those are and then, of course, homeless women vets. Those are my 4 priorities. But let me just paint you a picture so that you'll know. According to the VA, they estimate 131,000 veterans are homeless at any given night. The vast majority of this population is single and comes from poor, disadvantaged communities. 45% suffer from mental illness. Half have substance abuse problems, probably because they can't deal with their stress, the illness, the mental illness. America's homeless veterans have served from World War II onward, and 47% of the homeless veterans have served during Vietnam. More than 67% of them served our country for at least 3 years, and 33% were stationed in a war zone. One of the things that the Women's Bureau did is that we conducted what's called listening sessions. And those listening sessions, we went out and we actually talked to homeless women in shelters to hear directly from them what were the issues. The listening session participants consisted of 75 women veterans who are currently homeless, and some with their families in the shelter. And 3 of the women recently have secured permanent housing. The women veterans range from age mid-20s into their early 60s, with the majority of them being in their 40s and 50s, and represented diversity in the group. So, for example, African American women were 47%, Caucasian 42%, Latinas 71%, and then 4% all others. The service providers represented the government and community-based organizations offering advocacy, counseling, health resources, employment training, and transitional housing. The Women's Bureau's complete summary of the women's veterans who were part of the listening session is featured on our website at www.dol.gov/WB. I wanted to share that with you in case you want more information. What we did was we went specifically to New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, Kansas, California, Oregon, and Washington. Based on these listening sessions, These are the things that we learned. Unemployment. Many women veterans lost their jobs, did not have enough job training, or had difficulty transferring their skills obtained in the military to civilian economy. The lack of veterans benefits also played a role. Many women veterans just did not get enough information about the benefits that they were entitled to. Mental health issues due to sexual trauma while in the military, in addition to the post-traumatic stress disorder, was a growing problem among the women. In talking with these women, we found that existing programs and services for the veterans did not take into account the needs of women. Programs that are supposed to be gender neutral fail to ensure equality in the levels and types of assistance provided to both men and women. Based on our findings of these sessions, the Women's Bureau is now testing different types of projects or models to better serve women veterans and homeless women veterans. So, for example, in Washington, D.C. recently, the Women's Bureau conducted a job fair specifically for women vets with companies who had actual jobs, because if they didn't have actual jobs, we didn't want them at the fair. We wanted to connect the women veterans to actual jobs. We found that out of the 50 that actually came, only 14 got a second interview. And we're watching to see how many of the 14 actually get jobs. In Missouri, we're partnering with a female group, and we're doing what they call a stand down, and specifically for women vets. And in that stand down, they will be provided information and given an orientation specifically for them, and the types of assistance that homeless veterans need: food, clothing, medical, mental health assistance, job counseling, and referrals. We're also creating a web-based resource guide for homeless women vets. And one of the things that we learned is that the majority of homeless women vets are concentrated in California, in New York, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and the state of Washington. And then what we're doing is we're working with a group in Seattle on a case study of 8 homeless women vets, and are working to connect them to permanent housing, as well as to provide them the kind of psychological needs that they have. For all of this, what we're doing is trying to see what type of model works. Based on our listening session, and we work very closely with vets in the department, which is the Veterans Employment and Training Unit. We work very closely with them. This week, based on our listening sessions, they have issued an RFP, which if you want, you can take a look on our website, with regard to homeless women vets and their families, or homeless men with their families, veterans with their families. It's a $5 million grant, a competitive grant, that will be issued to 6 providers. And what we're hoping to do, again, between the models that we're trying to look at and the models that this will create, try to find ways in which we can specifically deal with homeless women and their children. Based on this feedback, we will be able to show our findings and see what is replicable, which is what we need to do. I'd just like to share a comment, some of the comments from the women. One woman noted, "Thank you for providing this job fair for women vets. Some of us didn't know that the information was available." Another woman noted, quote, "Thanks for not looking at us as if we're invisible," end quote. For me, this statement demonstrates why the Women's Bureau is working on this very important issue. We're working to ensure that women transitioning from military to civilian life are not forgotten. In collaboration with other agencies, federal, local, and also advocates, we're working to find a successful way to reintegrate the women from these homeless women's shelters, give them the kinds of supportive services that they need to transition and reintegrate into the workforce, civilian workforce, as well as into permanent housing. So with that, I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Perhaps in the interest of time, we might take a couple of questions at once, and then
Okay, great.
if people do have that many questions. Yes, in the back, please. Just wait for the microphone.
When you do a job fair or or something in order to identify people who need employment or need a home, how do you reach out to those people? Where do you find them so that they know about it and they can take advantage of it?
I think in this particular case, my regional office contacted the VA, contacted the advocacy groups, and that's how they found the women. And then what they did was they looked for employers who had actual jobs, invited them, more registered than actually came. And then I think maybe about 150 may have registered. 50 actually came, and then now 14 have second interviews, and we're hoping that all 14 get jobs.
Do you have numbers on how many homeless women there are?
We estimate, I think, about 6,000 homeless women, concentrated mostly in those 6 states that I talked about.
Okay, I took only one question because there weren't any other hands. Are there? Okay, Sonia, please.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. This is great. I'm really glad that the Women's Bureau is undertaking this. Could you say a little bit about whether you have a sense of whether the reasons for women veterans becoming homeless are different or the same as for male veterans becoming homeless, or is there a different scenario involved?
I think from what we learned is that although both veterans suffer from post-traumatic syndrome, I think on top of that, you have the situation of sexual assault. And one of the reasons why we're doing an all-female stand-down with a third party is because the stand-downs that are done, I think, by the VA or by some of the other groups include males. And because of certain issues, they don't want to actually deal sometimes with other males. So as a result, they said that some of the services that are provided, it's very difficult for them to go and be in a co-ed situation. So part of what we're trying to do is see whether or not, as a model, women helping other women is a way to deal with this. And by the way, we're also working with VA. We're working with the other federal agencies, so it's not just the Women's Bureau by itself, but this is our contribution because we saw this as a very particularly vulnerable population in terms of not just women vets, but homeless women vets. And we feel that at a time when, I guess, in the history of our country is the largest influx of women fighting in the military. If they went out there and fought for us, we have to fight for them. And I think this is our way of trying to give back to them.
Thank you. One last question.
Thank you. I'm Kate Sylvester from America's Promise. Do you have any data on how many of these women have children, what their child custody situations are?
No, I don't have any of that, but as we go forward, we will try to inquire and find out, because we do know that many of them are there with their families, with their children in the homeless shelters. That we know. The numbers, I don't know. As part of this RFP that we have, it's specifically geared for homeless women and their families in the shelters, so we'll probably have a better idea after that RFP is let out and after the work is completed.
Well, thank you so much. It sounds as if there are a lot of problems to be solved, but you're on your way to collecting the information and solving them. And so our hearts are with you. Thank you again for taking the time for doing this.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me give you a hug. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Okay, now as you can see, we lost people for the earlier panels today, but we are compensating for it now by giving you a full range of really, really interesting people. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.
And I'll just introduce them briefly. What we're going to be hearing about is a good deal more, actually, about people from military families and the kind of organization that is being done. And one of the things we haven't talked so much about yet today is people with long-term deployments and exactly what happens to them. And so we're going to be hearing about that as well. So I'm just going to introduce each of our speakers now and in order, and then they will take the microphone, and of course we'll have questions at the end. Starting with Eliza Nesmith, who is the Air Force Chief of Family Member Programs and who has served in military child programs both in this country and abroad for 26 years. And her responsibilities include developing and coordinating policy with the Office of Family Policy, the military services, organizations for child care and youth, and a host of other organizations and entities. So this is a real networking lady with a great deal of expertise. Our speaker after that will be Joyce Wessel-Wazer, who has been the Executive Director of the National Military Family Association since 2007. She has represented military families on committees and task forces for offices and agencies of the DoD and military services, and has written a chapter entitled Transforming Support to Military Families and Communities in the book Filling the Ranks, Transforming the U.S. Military Personnel System. Our speaker after that is Kathy Roth-Duquet, who is chair and founder of the military family organization Blue Star Families. She's an author as well as a former Clinton White House and Pentagon appointee. She currently serves as senior legal advisor to the Center for Naval Analysis. She's also a fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Mary Keller is the president and CEO as well as a co-founder of the Military Child Education Coalition, which serves around the world as an advocate for military children. She was the chief researcher and author for the U.S. Army's Secondary Education Transition Study, and she co-authored the Coalition's School Transition Study for the U.S. Pacific Command in the year 2005. And then Shelley McDermott Wadsworth is a professor in the Department of Child Development and Family Studies at Purdue University, where she also directs the Military Family Research Institute and the Center for Families, and as well is an associate dean. She currently serves on the Returning Veterans Committee of the Institute of Medicine. So 5 extraordinarily distinguished panelists, and we will start with Eliza Nesmith.
Thank you.
If you can get up or sit, whichever you prefer. What do you feel most comfortable
this
doing?
This will be great. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me personally to sit on the panel, but also thanks to the Wilson Center for shining a spotlight on this very important issue that you're all here to discuss today. As the introduction stated, I am in a policy office. I work for the Air Force. There are distinct differences among all of the services. I've found over the years that the general public has a tendency to think that they all operate alike, that they have different the same missions, and that they are all rather like it's the military, or as the popular press is saying, that it's all soldiers. So of course we have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines as well, and they have very distinct cultures, not only with the military member, but also with the families who are serving with them. So as mentioned, I am in Air Force programs. I've been doing this for quite a long time by choice, kind of stumbled into it, but thought that it's really worthwhile work because I think the mission is important. Regardless of where you are, by politics, it still is an important type of work, whether you think that we have a military that's to fight wars or to defend peace. It doesn't really matter when I'm in conversation with you. I'm from South Georgia. I try not to engage with my high school friends on this topic. I engage with a few people rarely because this is what I'm paid to do. I feel committed to it and have been doing it for a long time, but I work for the administration, and so as long as I agree with what I'm doing and what the administration says, then that's what I'm here for. The bureaucracy aside, even regardless of what your politics are, these are families that are serving. And I'll speak to Air Force. We're located in 35 countries. We're in 35 states. We're in 7 foreign countries. We're in the District of Columbia. We're in a territory, and are spread out all over the world, from Turkey to Korea to North Dakota to southern Texas. Families are stationed there. We have very few locations where families are not with their airmen. We also have a group of people who are in different locations that are all around the world who may or may not have their families. So my job is to make sure that family programs are well-resourced, that we work with our partners, and that we provide the services that are needed for military families. If you've never been on a military base, you might find it surprising the microcosm of the rest of the country that a military base can provide. We have supermarkets, we have department stores, we have social workers, we have doctors, we have counseling centers, we have child care centers, we have marinas in some places, we have golf courses, we have bowling centers. We have some nice installations that are good to be assigned to. People have a military way of life. In the Air Force, we still have about 15 to 20% of our young people who will join the service. So they are from birth to adults, are making a choice because of the military way of life. By definition, one parent in a family has a paid job. So that sets us apart somewhat from other people who are outside, who may not have an income or a stable home. They have an opportunity to live in government housing. Over the last 5 or 6 or 8 years, we have been partnering more with the civilian sector to have housing that's out in the communities rather than centric to a base. Quite frankly, that has done something to support services that are on base. And what are we doing about a sense of community? Before, when you walked in a base or you drove on a base, you were all contained, and so you didn't have to go out into a housing area and find the people in the community. So it's changed the way that we're approaching programs in the support side, in trying to reach out not only to active duty members who are living away, but since the war and 9/11, the Guard and Reserve have played such a tremendous part in this war and the support. How do we reach those families as well as those members? One thing that I think that probably the research may be discussed is children who are living out in communities who are not very well populated with other military kids. They're finding themselves isolated in these communities. They may not even identify themselves as military young people. They may not think about what their parent does until they deploy, and they're gone for a long time. But they've found in some communities, in some sectors, where the town will have a strong opinion about the war and whether we should be in it or not. And perhaps teachers will espouse this in the classrooms, forgetting that the young person does have a parent. So this causes these feelings of shame. Oh, my parent does this, and I don't want to tell anyone. So children are just keeping these kinds of thoughts inside themselves. So we have quite a few support programs through national partnerships. All the services do this through our USDA and 4-H partnerships, where we can reach every county in the United States, overseas and in territories. So we partner with them so we can provide more services to young people. We partner with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, strong partnership there, so that we can reach out into communities and help young people with the sense of belonging that's so important to them at any age, but certainly as they're feeling these feelings of isolation. We have quite a few programs for spouses in the Air Force, as do the other services. One that we have is called HeartLink, where we are interested in getting young spouses who've just come into the Air Force in less than a year, and we teach them all the many, many acronyms that are peppered in everyday language. Sometimes I have to laugh at myself. I can write a whole sentence in only acronyms. And the really sad thing is that whoever I'm sending it to knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's just scary on a lot of levels, but it's a language that you have to learn in order to get by and to be able to get along in the environment. As I mentioned at the onset, I'm in a policy office. I'm here in the Washington area. And so the main part of my job is advocating for the programs on behalf of families that I may or may not see, certainly don't see them on a regular basis, hear from them quite frequently on telephone and by emails and the like. But my job is to be able to explain to senior leadership the importance for funding of programs, to let it, to advocate for it so that it can be relevant to the mission and get the funding for it. And when you're looking at very expensive aircraft or very expensive ships, sometimes it's hard to say, well, what's the payoff? Do we buy a new ship, or do we have to pay for the family programs? We hope that we win, but that's a constant conversation that we have. One of the things that's very important to the programs in the support area is working with partners, like the ones that you see on the panel. We work with on a daily, monthly, weekly basis to make sure that we're in sync with their advocacy and what we can do to expand our programs that are on the installations. We have about 175 of these partners that we work with quite frequently to try to help the military families get access to things that are on the outside if we can't provide them on the inside. You get used to being on a military installation, and I think about several years ago I was out at a base nearby where my sister lives, and I invited her to come on and come and spend the night with me and go to this function, and then she would leave. So I got her off base because she didn't have a little sticker on her car that would let her come in. So we parked off base, and then we drove on through, and we did the thing at the gate, and he checked the IDs, and we went on through. So I'm looking over at my sister, and she has this kind of death grip, and her face is all white. And I said, "What?" She said, "Did you notice that he had a gun?" And I said, "Yes, I did notice it. That was supposed to make you feel safe." And she said, "It didn't. It just scared me." And so I thought, well, that is really, really interesting point of view. People from the same family. My father's a World War II vet, and my husband's a Vietnam-era vet. But if you don't grow up with that, you have this idea potentially of what the military is about, and certainly guns and blowing things up and killing people and defending the peace may be what springs to mind. So if you don't know about the very rich support services that are provided for families so that those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines can go out and perform the mission, then it's important to know that. You may not know that the Department of Defense has the very high honor of having the premier child care program in the country. We like to say in the world, but really, we don't know about the world, but we certainly know in the country by quite a few parameters that the high quality of those programs are able to be sustained for the parents as they're moving from place to place. An important aspect of that is continuity. If a child's moving from Germany to Alabama to Korea, you want to have a certain sense of sameness as they're moving from place to place. So the military puts a lot of time and attention into that very basic benefit that a military member can get. Okay, great. 2 minutes. Thank you for that. So the support services that are offered are wide and extensive. We have many programs out there. It's always a challenge to us to advertise them in such a way that everyone knows. I would say that most information is passed word of mouth from person to person. You learn more from people as they have an experience, good or bad, at the last installation. Early on in my career, I worked in a child care center, and we had been working really hard to make it a very good center and had changed hours and changed all sorts of things. So I was talking with somebody out on the road and trying to get her to come in. She says, "Oh, I would never go there." And I said, "Why not?" She said, I said, "We've been working really hard on it." And she says, "Well, it's just not a good place, and the hours aren't good, and all of these things." And I said, "Well, have you been in? We've made a lot of changes in 6 months." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, I've never actually been in your center, but at my last base, it was terrible." And so the message that I leave is that the consistency of programs, not only among each of the individual services, is important, but also as a department, so that if a soldier has a good experience when he shows up at an Air Force base, and the same as at a Navy base or at a Marine base, that they have a pretty good sense that they're going to get the same level of care and know that they are being cared for and their families are. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Joy?
I guess I'll sit down too. Hi, it's great to be here, and it's great to be a part of this panel. At lunch, I referred to this panel to someone as the "It Takes a Village" panel. Just as military families come in all shapes and sizes and needs, and are definitely not a one-size-fits-all population, so we need a broad organizational response and partnerships between government entities, private organizations, university-based support service, and private citizens to do what needs to be done to support military families. And my organization is here because of the generosity of the vision. Well, it's here because of the vision of military spouses 40 years ago and to the present, and to the generosity of a lot of military family volunteers who gave their time and service all over those 40 years, and to the generosity of foundations, private individuals, corporations, and others who believe that what we were doing to support military families is important. And that generosity has never been stronger than it is right now. Our organization has done a lot for military families, and we do more and more all the time, and it's because people in the American public want to support military families. Military families are of the American public, they're of the broader community, and it's been gratifying to see the support that community has given all of us to increase our efforts to reach out to military families, learn what they need, and advocate for those needs, and then, when necessary, develop programs to support those needs. So here we are, heading into the ninth year of war. We know a lot about war, but we don't always know a lot about the families. We know that deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan are different. We believe, as an organization that supports military families, is staffed by military family members, hears from military families, that multiple prolonged deployments are straining those families. We also know that there have been a lot of programs and initiatives that have been put out there to support military families, not just on the Department of Defense and the individual service side, but also from private organizations, churches, civic groups, and communities. People have wanted to support military families, but there's a lot we don't know, and that knowledge is especially critical and missing on how are our children doing. Our organization had done surveys, done a lot of informal listening to families over the years, because that's what we do. But what we believed was missing was a large-scale cross-service and component. And when I speak of component, it's active duty, National Guard, Reserve, that research on military children and youth. There have been some research studies, but what was missing also was that large-scale encapsulation of what children were saying about what they needed. And after trying to prod Congress and Department of Defense and people with a lot bigger pockets than we as a small nonprofit, we finally said enough is enough. We've wasted so much time. We've missed golden opportunities in gathering baseline information about military children before the war, early in the war. We need to start capturing some of this information now to better serve families. And so we raised money from two foundations, the Robertson Foundation and the Sierra Club Foundation, and commissioned the RAND Corporation to do research that would go beyond the anecdotal information we've collected. And we chose RAND because we believed they had the experience necessary to do this kind of research, and also the credibility on the Hill and in the Department of Defense, which is what we wanted as well, because we wanted these findings to be taken seriously. We wanted to ask two questions. how are school-age military children faring, and what types of issues do military children face related to deployment. We were very lucky in that we had a sample population to do this research with. We sponsor a program called Operation Purple. It's a summer camp program for military children. Camps apply to us to host an Operation Purple camp. It's completely free to families thanks to donations from our sponsors. It's private camps, it's military installation youth programs, it's National Guard programs, it's a variety of camps across the country. We even have a camp this year in Germany. So we used the applicant pool from our Operation Purple program from 2008. We had more than 9,000 applications, and we were able to come up with a sample of 1,500 families that represented all the military services and all of the components. Children ages 11 to 17, we had, in that mix, we had 28% minorities, 47% girls. We followed these families over the course of a year, going back, surveying them for baseline information, and then going back 2 more times over the course of the year to see how those families were doing. And our baseline results were published in the January 2010 issue of the journal Pediatrics. Our longitudinal findings will be released in the next couple of weeks, but really bear out those baseline findings, and I will be talking about those to you just briefly today. So how are military children faring as compared to other U.S. children? And our researchers used common tools so that we could do these comparisons. There's some good news here. Military children are functioning at or above the U.S. average in academic engagement and in peer relationships. Where we're seeing issues, however, and functioning at lower levels are in family relationships, anxiety, and emotional difficulties. While the good news is 70% of our kids reported, and their caregivers reported, that they were doing pretty well, 30% of military children reported elevated anxiety symptoms, and that's compared to about a 15% in the civilian population. Slightly more than that, 34% reported higher emotional difficulties. And these are things like, are you having trouble sleeping? Do you sometimes feel afraid? Variety of questions to get at those emotional difficulties. When we looked at the information to say, what are some factors related to deployment that seem to be most important, we found four significant factors. And the interesting thing was that these factors held true across the services and across the components. And that was one of the things we wanted to see. Were we going to see different results for Guard and Reserve children versus active children? But in these 4 areas, we saw the same regardless of component. And these 4 factors were the age of the child. Older teens tended to have more issues related to deployment than younger teens in our sample. Both boys and girls reported certain issues, especially with reintegration. However, girls reported more challenges with reintegration. The cumulative months of deployment, the parents' deployment, was important. It didn't matter whether we were talking to Marine families who deploy on 7 or 8 months gone, equal time back, then gone again, or Army children Army families who experienced longer deployments, or Air Force families who had more frequent but shorter deployments. What was important wasn't the going and coming, but it was the cumulative time gone. We asked the caregiver to tell us how long was that service member gone over the last 3 years. And it was we looked at both frequency of deployment and the cumulative months, but it was the cumulative months of deployment that was the factor. Children did worse the longer time away the parent was. And the last factor was a real aha, moment. You love it when the research backs up everything that you've always felt you knew. For us in our association, and remember, we're military spouses, we've been saying for years, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Well, our research bore that out. Children did better when their caregiver did better. When the caregiver's mental health was in danger, then children had more issues. So our research bore out what we knew as military spouses. When we looked at older teens, the deployment challenges they faced that made it difficult. They were more likely to take on household responsibilities, such as taking care of siblings or doing more things around the house. They may be more likely to miss school activities. We heard from some who, wanted to get the driver's license, but caregivers said, nope, that's going to wait until your dad gets home. And then during reintegration, older teens had more issues with getting to know that returning parent again, adjusting to the new routine, and dealing with that returning parent's mood changes. Girls had some of those issues, but especially for reintegration, very important. They worried about that next deployment. They worried about that parent's mood changes, and they were more in touch with how the parents were getting along and more worried about the parents. I've talked about that cumulative months of deployment. The mental health of the caregiver, so important. Children whose non-deployed parent reported better mental health, experienced fewer challenges during and after the deployment, emotional difficulties, peer and family functioning issues, or challenges with academic engagement. Everything was better when that parent was doing well. There's been other research that maybe Shelley will talk about, or we can talk about during questions, that has just been released in the last few months. We're finally starting to see some research on military families bearing out some of these issues, but expanding on some of the questions that we've raised. Future researchers will have plenty to do. But looking at that cumulative time gone, there was a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at mental health service usage by Army spouses that showed their use of military medical health care services for behavioral health issues went up the longer that service member was deployed. We know that there are a lot of good programs out there. We know that a lot of the things were done. Our challenge now is to look at those programs in light of the research, and use that research to start setting outcomes, setting measurements, and saying, if this is what we know because families are telling us is going on, how can we structure our programs? If we know that total months deployed matters, how do we maintain the mental health of that 70% who are doing okay as they continue to experience more deployments? How do we target programs for older kids and not take away from the programs for the younger kids, remembering that we have a lot more little kids in military families because of the age of the force? How do we help caregivers balance strike that work-life balance, and how do we help them take care of themselves? The military services have put a lot of effort into creating respite care programs for caregivers of younger children. What's the respite for a mom with a house full of teenagers? And how do we help them find that? And how do we use these results of the research and talk about them in such a way that we're not seeming critical of our military service members? Nancy talked a lot about guilt. Well, if a military service member getting ready for a deployment reads some of the research that's coming out now and says, look what I'm doing to my child, how do we help them? How do we help them do something constructive with that? How do we help them find ways to meet their service obligations and their desire to serve while keeping them connected with their children to rebuild that family relationship? There's a lot for all of us to do. Our association is sponsoring a summit on May 11th and 12th, where we're gathering folks, not just from the military side, but from private organizations and other agencies, to look at how we can use this research to target programs, evaluate programs, and build new partnerships to work together to meet some of these needs and think about how to continue to meet them, because even after the war goes away, we're going to be dealing with the legacy of 9 years so far. How many years of war? As somebody said this morning, a lot of these kids have spent at least half or most of their lives dealing with deployments. We as a nation have an obligation to to recognize that legacy and provide the support they need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I get to sit here between two of my role models. Very lucky, Joyce and Mary. Thank you for the Wilson Institute for bringing us here, and for Charles DeBuff for sponsoring this. I was particularly happy about this conference because it represents academia bringing us here, and academia is an unusual bedfellow for people who are involved with military service. And I think perhaps academia is one of the places where the disconnect between the larger society and the military is the greatest. I don't know that we're particularly addressing that here, because I don't know how many people from academia who aren't already engaged on some level with the military are here, but I know it's being filmed, and maybe it will spark an ability for us to discuss this issue more. There's a couple things that strike me when we talk about what are the impacts on military families of this long war in the context of the Wilson Institute. First of all, why should anyone outside the military care? And secondly, why is there a disconnect perhaps between academia and the military community, and what perhaps is missing? I think, it's a lot of people care about it because they feel sorry for us. And they hear terrible stories, and there's a certain amount of guilt, and there's a long narrative that's been particularly strong in the country since the Vietnam War that people who participate in military service are victims of a bad system. And it's easy to talk about the harm that comes from being engaged with the military in a way that fits into this narrative. But that's not a narrative that's helpful for those of us who serve, because it is a volunteer force. And those of us who are still who aren't looking at this in our back view mirror, but who are steering a car and have to be driving forward as well, need to feel that this is something that the society values, and needs to feel that good, strong, capable people are coming in, and that part of what is going on, especially for those who are military family members, is that we're partners in this service that is necessary for our country. We're not the accoutrements. It's not the old value anymore, where if we wanted you to have if we wanted you to have a spouse, we'd issue you one. And frankly, I want to retire the term brat and have us come up with another one, because that's also someone who's unwanted. The spouse and the child are no longer unwanted. They're now a necessary partner in national security, and we need to treat them that way. But what's national security? When people say, regardless of your politics, we have to appreciate people who serve, I feel like we need to go back and do a civics lesson in America. Because it's not that, gee, if you're against the war, then maybe you would be against military service. The way democracy works is that the whole of the society figures out what we're going to do and someone executes it. And it doesn't mean that because your opinion is different than the constitutional processes that lead to democracy, you get to be against it. Otherwise, we don't have democracy. There is no politics that can be against military service in the democratic system that we have right now. And so anyone who brings politics into the equation, I think, is misunderstanding it and is undermining the experience that military families have. So I'd like that to be something that we take going forward. Being a military family member isn't just about what your copay for TRICARE is. It's about what the service you're doing for your country is and how that's shared by the rest of the country. So I think it's natural that there's a bit of a disconnect between academia and those who serve in the military, because in a lot of ways academic values are very different than military values. In academia, you develop Socratic skills where you are kind of counter to authority, and you're developing your own ideas in a way that distinguish you and make your particular career successful and an individual contribution. And military service is really not about an individual contribution per se. It's about something that's subsumed into what's good for the organization, what's good for the unit, what's good for the group. There's a natural lack of affinity there. In military service, and one thing I haven't heard discussed here, spirituality is very important.
There aren't any. There's an expression: there aren't any atheists in foxholes. There's not very many on the home front either, because there's tremendous challenges that are involved with an existential choice to put the person who you love in harm's way. For what reason? And one of the few responses to that is spiritual. I don't think we will understand military families or the military experience without including a spiritual discussion into the equation, and without including the chaplain corps and those kinds of things in it as well. That's not something that's usually part of academia. It's not something that's easily measured. It's not something that's that's susceptible to microscopic intent. So it's another thing I'd like to put on the table. I think we will be better off when we have a bit of a reconciliation between academia and military service, which includes encouraging military service at our top institutions, which is the places where I think it's probably least comfortable right now in America for someone to choose to serve. And I just would like to have that be on the table of this discussion as well, because I think that's part of what's going on here. I really appreciate the study that NMFA funded. I think it's something the government or Congress should have done. I'm sorry the burden fell on you to fund it, but it's a necessary and important thing. When Blue Star Families did our survey in conjunction with a number of military family organizations last year, we did find that the top concern for military families was the effective deployment on dependent children, and also that spouses felt a need for more help with support and morale during deployment and were concerned about reintegration. That's something that that I think has a lot to do with what the effect of this long war is on families. I spoke recently in Norfolk to a group of a mixed services spouse organization, and I jettisoned my expected remarks based on my own sort of feelings of that moment of feeling a little bit at the end of my rope, frankly. And I asked the people who were there in the room, there was a couple hundred people, why do we do what we do? Because this is a volunteer force. None of us have to do this. Why do we do it? And when we think that maybe we're not going to do it any longer, why do we think that? Mm-hmm. And it was a really dynamic, fascinating, interesting discussion, at least to those of us who were in the room. We do it because there are great things that come to our families from doing it. We feel proud of ourselves. Our kids feel proud of what they're doing. Our kids feel safe and connected to a community in the way that doesn't always happen in the larger society. That's very ironic because we're experiencing war. We feel part of a community of goodwill. And there's lessons for the larger society that I think the military community has to offer to that society, and I hope we could bring back in. Why do we think we won't do it anymore? Because we wonder if it's fair to our children. This is something Mary's going to talk about more, and Joyce spoke about what already. My children are 8 and 12. All they know is a world at war. But their peers outside of our little world don't know that world at all. They're having a very unusual experience in America. There's 900,000 children are part of the active duty military, and that's a very, very small percentage of our nation. My daughter has gone to 7 schools, and she's in 6th grade. My son gets to hug his daddy goodnight on the monitor, via Skype, and he's pretty sad that no one can throw the baseball for him. So you wonder, why do we do this, and should we keep doing it? And the answer to that matters, because what we do worldwide is extraordinarily consequential. We have well over 100,000 people, 200,000 people deployed around the world who aren't in Afghanistan and Iraq. And both Democrats and Republican foreign policy elites concur that that's the national security strategy they have since the end of the Cold War, and there's no real movement different. So this is the kind of military our country is setting ourselves up to have, and unless it can be something that's embraced by our country, we're not going to be able to be successful as a country. So the effects that this long war has on military families matters, but also the effect that military families' pressures have on the military itself matters to the country. And that's, I think, the circle I want to bring here. This isn't just about welfare in an underserved community. It's about the state of our democracy, to my mind. So I think it's a great topic for a serious institution like Wilson. I'm glad we're here discussing it, and I look forward to what comes out of a program like this one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mary?
I'd like to add my gratitude to the Wilson Institute and to George Washington University and everyone that's worked so hard and been so patient with the panel, like us making a collective decision about whether or not we would use PowerPoint slides or not. I guess you can figure out what our collective decision was. I want to tell you a little bit about Military Child Education Coalition. I want to talk about military children, some of the things that we're learning in our perspectives, both in our research and in the field. And also, we were asked to think about some of the gaps that we thought were out there as a team, and we really are a team. Military Child Education Coalition has been around for 14 years, and our name really tells you what our mission is. We're focused on children from birth through college age whose parents serve in the active duty forces, the National Guard, and the reserves. And we do that through, we actually have field-based programs. We have 230 high schools with both military and civilian children participating in our programs, where kids learn in the high school setting how to be peer support for any child who's new or going through some sort of changes in their lives. Like our student-to-student programs, it's called our student-to-student programs, help kids through various hurricanes and other kinds of things that have happened in communities. We also have 120 middle schools with our programs. We employ military spouses around the world. We have over 200 military spouses that work directly for our organization, and many of them work in our parent-to-parent program. And I just got the data where they've trained 72,000 military-connected parents in the last 3.5 years. So, I mean, it makes a huge difference. You know what? Parents talk to each other, and so we just really have to give them good information and give them a chance to switch that information on. We also do extensive professional development. I have some stories that I'm going to tell you about that. We're certified through many accreditation agencies and also give graduate credit for our courses. And the other thing we do is a lot of research, so I want to share that with you. But first of all, let me tell you about the kids. At any given point in time, there's almost 2 million military-connected kids. 75% of those kids are below age 12. Now, when I talk about 2 million, I'm talking birth through college age. And they have parents in the active duty forces, the National Guard, and the reserves. About 1.1 million of those kiddos are school age, K-12. And I don't know about you, but 1.1 million is kind of, okay, what does that mean? It's the size of the New York City public schools. So if we took all military kids, we put them in one school district, they would be the size of the New York City public schools. So nobody would ever think that every student in the New York City schools had the same experience, came from the same families, had the same sort of capacities, needs, wants, hopes. And that's also true for military kids, because the most important fact to remember about military kids is they're kids first. They're kids first. And they're babies first, and they're toddlers first, and they're third graders, and they're seventh graders, and they're annoying preteens, just like any other annoying preteen. And they're teenagers, and they're college kids who are trying to figure their way around and trying to all help their families. But the unique thing about a military child is they have a parent who every day serves our nation, and that is a parent who's in active duty, but every day a parent who's in the National Guard and Reserves serves too, because every day they're giving a component of their life to leave that civilian life and to serve our nation. About 75% of those kids whose parents are active duty live off the base, post, or camp. So they're in classrooms with everybody else's kids. Only 8% of military-connected kids, actually a little less, attend the Department of Defense schools. Most Americans don't have personal experience with the military, and certainly most educators do not have personal experience, with the military. So, sometimes they get mixed up and think that military kids are in those military schools. And it's interesting, late at night, sometimes we'll get a call at our office and, some very upset parent will call and say, I can't stand it with this child anymore. Put him in one of your military schools. Background you hear, no, Mama, not me, I'll be good. We say, no, that's really not what we do. But, military kids are in the classrooms with every other child. And we have to first recognize their need as being the need of a child. Now, what they also experience with multiple deployments is the disruption in the home setting and that continuity of parenting. And that is so important for children. Routine and predictability are tremendously important for children. From the new baby to the elementary age child, to the preschooler and teen and youth, that predictability, because they need those loving adults around them that will help them frame their world. And that means the developmental need of the child has to be recognized, the situation that the family is in, and also the child's temperament. Sometimes a teacher will say, well, I was looking at this child and I realized their parent was deployed and they had a worried look on their face, and I went up and said, you're obviously worried about your dad being deployed. And the child said to me, I'm really worried about the long division. Kids are thinking as children, and so we have to always balance that perspective. For young children, though, if you take their egocentrism and you mix it up with their associative logic, like the world is about me and I'm going to, all boys like dogs and all girls like cats, and you put those kind of things together, kids end up with magical thinking. And that's true for all children. But for a military child whose parent comes back profoundly changed, it can mean that child thinks that parents, maybe parenting style behavior that's different is because they did something, or because it's associated with if I had been good, or if I had said good night, or I didn't really want to talk on Skype that night. And then, Dad came back different. So then I'm responsible for that. So then the parent is trying to deal with their issues of suddenly single parenting or single parenting for extended periods of times or repeated periods of times, and trying to listen wisely, thoughtfully, carefully, and help that child worry well. Okay, what do I mean about worrying well? And that's giving the child the acknowledgement. I understand why you're worried, but this is really, Dad or Mom have come back and they're trying to get used to something, just like we're trying to get used to them being here. That doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. Sometimes we overwhelm kids and families with too many choices. We've done a lot of work around the whole idea of behavioral economics and what does too many choices, what does that mean for families? And Barry Schwartz talks about the paradox of choice in his work at Swarthmore. Sometimes I think we all think as parents, as caregivers, as nonprofit organizations, as friends, well, one or two choices are good, so a whole lot of choices must be better. But what we know for families, for parents, too many choices, especially when you're stressed, can actually add to the stress and cause people to shut down. This is also true for children. So being able to frame choices for kids from loving parents and loving adults that are in schools and in their communities and in their homes is so important for establishing that equilibrium for kids, that no matter what happens, there are adults around you who care about you, who are proud of the service of your family, who acknowledge that, but also are going to help you frame that in the context of the multiple ecologies that kids live in: school, home, community, the ballpark, everywhere that kids live. And that it means that how do we frame it around students that are peers? How do we help teachers and others know what that means? And how do people slow down? And the hard thing is, after 9 years of war, people can be worn out with it. So I wanted to tell you we're doing a big research project for General Casey, the Chief of Staff of the Army, Education and Military Child 21st Century. Right now we have 900 in-depth interviews, and we're using in vivo software, and we love this software. So we're having a researcher geeky moment right here. But, you know, the important things are what people tell you in their story, in-depth stories. So interviewing a principal, he said, you know, I couldn't figure out why our parent-teacher conferences were getting way off schedule. Way off schedule. We have the parents all lined up. They're supposed to come in every 30 minutes. After the first group of parents, we're off schedule. And then we talked to the faculty, and what we realized was we have young families. Average age of a military parent is just 27. A lot of babies, 40% below age 8 of the children. That was started off talking about the parent-teacher conference and the spelling and the report card, but spent the majority of the conference being so grateful that that teacher was just listening to them. So what we've learned is to slow down. How elegant is that? And just listen to people. Just slow down and listen. What we also learned from a 6th grader that we interviewed, brilliant kid, who said, you know what, I figured out when my dad comes home, I just have to help him get rehabilitated. You know, she said, I'm serious, that's what I've got to say. So it's slowing down and it's listening. And it's listening to the developmental needs of kids, the situational needs that they go through, but also looking at their school performance. In the research in terms of the gap, there's a lot of assumptions being made about military kids and their academic performance and things that are happening in their school that are not really based in solid evidence, more anecdotal story. And it could be true or not true. So we're working with the Department of Education. Department of Defense is also supporting this to get a military student identifier with the school data so that we can really look over time to see how military kids are doing. We've also partnered with the Gallup organization and America's Promise on the Gallup student poll, where out of the 250,000 kids 5th grade through 12th grade that were interviewed on the Gallup student poll, 25,000 of those kids have identified themselves as military connected. And we're working with them now with a grant that we have from the Bob Woodruff Family Foundation to deep dive into that data. It comes into 3 components about a campus, what kind of climate, and how do you help kids foster hope. And Nancy, I know you would love to see this data. It's so important because hope has turned out to be so important in kids' goal setting and the depth, the way that they think, engagement. Do I know who to go to if I need help? Do I know how to use the resources in school? And well-being, can I make good choices? So we've got to know more about military kids. As Joyce said, we need to know more on the long term, but together this mosaic is starting to come together. But I'd ask you to remember first and foremost is that they are kids first, and they deserve for us to capture their story so that later the story of these children will inform the story of children in the future.
Thank you. Shelley, thank you for being so patient.
Oh, I've enjoyed learning today. And I'm very glad to be here. And although my boss expresses skepticism about whether or not I work there because I travel so much, I do indeed work in academia. So I resonate with Kathy's point. I'm an administrator with staff but not line authority, and so I do, living in a culture of skepticism, I do sometimes fantasize about a clear and coherent and compliant chain of command. It doesn't exist. I work at Purdue University, which most people don't think of as a hotbed of military activity, but I will point out that we have about 500 ROTC students, about 300 students attending school on the GI Bill. We're home of one of the only university-based Operation Purple camps in the nation. We're the Midwestern home of the Entrepreneurship Boot Camp program. We're also the home of Dorothy Stratton, who was the Dean of Students at Purdue. In the earlier part of the century, she created the Coast Guard Reserve, who are naming a ship after her that will be commissioned in July with patronage from Michelle Obama. So although I didn't know it when I started all of this, I'm joining a long line of people at Purdue with military connections. I framed my remarks today around questions that were in the preamble to this session. So I've tried to think about what are families' needs, how are families' needs being met, and how are they not being met. So what I'm about to tell you is sort of my armchair theory about some of this. When we think about families' needs, I think it can work to think about them in terms of a combat operational stress continuum, and you might not know that term, but there's actually a very conceptually appealing practice that's been used in some parts of the military to organize people's states of mind and thinking about combat exposure into green, yellow, and red, or green, orange, and red zones. When you think about families' needs, I would argue that green needs, the sort of lowest level, most universal sorts of needs, are education about military life and how to function in military life, prevention activities that help to prepare people for the challenges of deployment and other seminal challenges of military life, and also efforts to address policy gaps, such as the work that Mary has done to try to make it easier for military kids to move around the country. Yellow needs, I would argue, might be thought of as needs that are more severe and related to actually undergoing things like moves or deployments. For example, logistical challenges of taking care of a household and a family when half the adult labor force has disappeared, or when someone is in harm's way and you're worried about them every day, and that produces stress in both parents and children. Military spouses are underemployed, and that is an issue. And finally, red challenges in terms of needs include things like marital instability, maltreatment, maltreatment problems that need to be addressed, psychological health problems that are the sequelae of exposure to combat, and the corrosion that comes from that to family life, and problems in the healthcare infrastructure. Those are just some really quick ideas about some of the needs that probably we all have spent much of our days thinking about. But it's also very important to remember that military families are very diverse, and you've heard that today from people who have spoken, but I really do want to underscore it. We say the word family a lot in the military, but historically in programs, policies, and practices, what that means is a heterosexual married spouse and biological or adopted, and in some cases, stepchildren. And any other kind of family is not so well represented in policies, programs, and practices, and I think that that is an issue. I was told, I gave a talk a little while ago, and I used the word partner to refer to unmarried partners of service members, boyfriends, girlfriends. And I learned later that someone sort of mildly took issue with my remark because they assumed I was referring to gay people. And the law, the policies hadn't changed yet. But what that told me was how rigid the thinking about married spouses is, and yet half the force is unmarried and presumably wants to form life partnerships. Also female service members and their families, I think, don't yet get enough attention in our programs, practices, and policies. Military families are models of strength, and they are models of vulnerability. We talk about them sometimes only from the perspective of vulnerability, but they have a great deal to teach us about strength, and we need to pay attention to those lessons. Woe the academic researcher who gathers a bunch of data on military families and starts looking at the averages and expects to see off the charts conflict and off the charts divorce and off the charts drug abuse. It's not what you see. It's not what you see. Military families are models of strength and vulnerability. And the problems of the civilian community are the problems of the military community, and vice versa. Huge percentages of our military families, even in the active component, live in civilian communities. Their children attend civilian schools. And of course, every member of the reserve component lives in civilian communities, and their children go to civilian schools, and they get their care, all kinds of care, from civilian providers. So to talk as though the military and civilian communities are like this is not correct, because even for members of the active component, it's much more like this. So how are families' needs being met, and how are they not being met? over the course of the current conflicts, both DoD and VA have launched many new supports, many creative ideas, and have really tried very, very hard to create an infrastructure for support that was never envisioned when we made the transition to a force that relies so heavily on the reserve component. The complete transformation that decision required really is only being completed now. And one of the best known instances of innovation in that area is Military OneSource, which some of you may know about, some of you may not, but the mother of Military OneSource is in the room. And it's been, can I say it?
Yes, do.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at her to say, is it okay? Aggie Byers from Office of Military Community and Family Policy. There are creative partnerships with the Red Cross, with Sesame Workshop, with the National Association of Child Care Resource and Referral. Lots of new ideas being created. The visibility of family issues and visible commitments to families really have come up a lot. But my impression is that sometimes the rhetoric turns out to be, unintentionally, I'll accept, superficial, in the sense that when push ever comes to shove and people are forced to choose, many decisions revert to giving the service member priority. So as soon as resources get tight, family members go to the back of the line. As soon as someone starts feeling like they're outside their comfort zone, they start focusing on the service member. And to some extent, that's perfectly understandable. It's the service member who is the point of the spear. But deployments and military life happen to families, happen to systems. And as long as we don't acknowledge that and design programs, policies, and practices that don't acknowledge that, I think we won't be getting the full value from those things. In civilian communities, we've also seen an explosion of funding, a lot of innovation, a lot of strategies and programs, but it's been hard to get evaluation data, as has been the case in the military. I won't bore you with all the reasons why. It's incredibly hard to do. I'll just tell you that it is. And the result, though, has been a very complicated landscape that is frustrating for families, I know, and frustrating for everyone who tries to help them. And then we end up with this sort of weird Red Sea, where on the one side are mountains of providers who would like to help military families, and it seems like on the other side, mountains of military families who are furious that they're not getting the support that they need, and this parting of the waves in the middle that we seem to have a terrible time getting across, and that's definitely a problem. I hear it as a theme that we need to focus, and even General Sutton said it a little bit this morning, you know, we need to focus and choose what works and promote what works. But there's a caution there, which is that nobody, I believe, has the power to tidy up the landscape completely. DoD can control what DoD does with its money. VA can control what VA does with its money. DoD can't control what the Sierra Club does. You know, so to the extent that we are focused too much on what to stop doing and how to stop doing it, and not enough on how to deal with harnessing and focusing and leveraging and supporting all of this creativity and innovation, I think we're going to find ourselves frustrated in the end. Researchers also, I think, have not been as constructive as they might, in the sense that I think there's an enormous and to some extent disproportionate attention to post-traumatic stress disorder, which is only one of a long list of sequelae of combat exposure, that it truly is comorbid with many things, but is only one of many things. I think there's been a relative paucity of attention to families and family system dynamics. If you look at the studies that NIH has funded so far, they're overwhelmingly focused on treatment of service members and relatively little attention to families. And while I was here, I got an email that a funding program that I had applied for was canceled. You know, for whatever reason, I think that we're still not seeing as much attention to really trying to understand what families are experiencing as much as we might. But there's a tension there, too, which is that families are tired and they're burdened and they don't want to be treated like rats in a maze or bugs on a slide. And it's annoying. And I sympathize with that. I'm part of the problem. But how do you know how to fix problems if you can't understand what they are? And so we're caught in that bind. I'll close by just spending a couple of minutes telling you about what we're doing. How are we responding to these challenges at the Military Family Research Institute? Even though our name has research in it, for the last few years, I've been asked to put I've been asked to put somebody else's money where my mouth is, and really try to practice what we preach. So I started out strictly as a researcher, and now I'm also engaged in engagement and outreach activities, which is a really wonderful opportunity. So we work to generate important new knowledge about military families, and for example, we have been really working hard on trying to understand the course of reintegration for families, the sort of typical and atypical paths toward successful reintegration following deployment. And over the next year, hopefully you'll see a bunch of papers coming out in the scientific press about that. We also conduct work to support military families. The best example there is evidence-based programming that we develop and deliver for children of reserve component families as part of the Yellow Ribbon Reintegration Program, which is really a military academic partnership with the goal of trying to help children and their families. And we also work to strengthen civilian communities, primarily in our state, by raising awareness and by raising the preparation of civilian communities and the professionals in them to receive and support the military families who live among them. I mentioned those things not as a commercial, although of course I guess it was, but to illustrate, I think, some of the ways that academia can contribute and some of the work that we've been privileged to do with the support and education of people, many of whom are in this room, who have taught us and helped us learn how it is we might be able to be useful. So I offer it as an example to any of you who have any interest in getting involved in those activities.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I mean, this was really quite wonderful. There's such a wealth of information and so many ideas to think about that it's going to be hard to put them all together right away. But perhaps you can help with all of that with your questions. So the floor is now open for whatever you would like to ask. Oh, do we have end of day quiet here? Oh, I'm sorry. There's some lady in the back, please.
Hi, I'm Julia Pfaff. My question really goes to, it seems sort of a reoccurring theme of the day, and it's been a reoccurring theme at least since I had Joyce's job, or before, that there's lots of programs out there, there's lots of help out there, but like you said, there's this red sea between the providers of the help and the people who need the help. And we don't ever seem to talk about how do we get across the Red Sea? Where's Moses? Does he exist? And, you know, it goes back to some of the even points that I think what Christy was bringing out about being on the ground and, you know, asking for help, asking for suicide prevention, basic training. Like, what do you say to somebody when they come? I don't want to be a counselor, but how do I deal with this problem? And how do I teach the wife of an E6 how to deal with the problem when the wife of the E4 comes to her and says, you know, I can't take it anymore. And those programs exist. They exist in the civilian community for civilians. How do we bridge this gap?
I'll start, and
Good,
she's
I'm
going
glad
to
you have
chime
the
in.
answer.
No, I don't. But I think a lot more people are talking about that. But sometimes egos and ownership get in the way. We have a tradition, and it's not just among the people who work for the military services or the Department of Defense. It's also among a lot of nonprofits. We have the "if you build it, they will come" tradition. You know, we'll establish a program, we'll put up a family center, we'll do something and tell everybody here we are, or we'll build a website and we'll say here we are. So I think we're starting to see different kinds of outreach. Part of that outreach is to the local community, the people who are already in touch with military families. General Sutton this morning talked about this pilot with the USO, where they're not making those USO volunteers counselors, but they're saying, we know you come in contact with a lot of service members and families, so here's some extra information for you. And we need to see more of that. And we need to have a really serious conversation with people who understand social networking and how technology works, so that we're not just doing another, if you build it, they will come in terms of our website, that we're doing some push to families at teachable moments and a push to people who support families at teachable moments, so that the information is there when they need it, and that somebody's checking on them. And it may be something like, let's give every returning service member a cell phone and then text them every once in a while with 2 questions. How you doing? Or, have you signed up for, your transition benefits at the VA, or whatever it is, but that there's a push. And you could do it during deployment. I mean, there's a push as well as a pull that has to happen. So I feel encouraged because I think people are talking about it, but to me, it involves reaching out beyond our comfort level as service providers who are enmeshed in the military system, to those folks who have ideas, who are willing to help, but are waiting, don't know who to ask and who to offer the help to. So I'm more encouraged, Julia, than I have been for a long time, but we still have a long way to go, and the problems just keep getting more complex.
Thanks. A group of military family and nonprofit organizations got together and hosted a conference back in January called the Joint Forces Conference, America Joins Forces for Military Families. Our administrator, Margaret Mullins, is here in the audience and is a Georgetown student who's joining Army OCS, so she is walking the walk. But we had representatives there from Joint Chiefs Office, the Secretary of Defense's Office, National Security Council, Senate Armed Services Committee. We had all of the people here on this panel represented. We had outside groups like Chamber of Commerce and United Council and Churches, USO Red Cross, with the idea of trying, if we get all the people who are kind of stakeholders and experts in this area and ask, what are the things all of us can agree are problems, and what are the top problems, so that we have a certain amount of legitimacy and ballast behind it, maybe we can move forward solutions. And there were top 3 ideas for missing and needed programming, and top 3 ideas for unmet areas of need, the top 3 ideas for unmet areas of, and pretty much this is what was agreed across the board by all groups. Top 3 unmet needs were mental health for families, children, and jobs for spouses. The programming that this group came out needed was some sort of comprehensive clearinghouse that allowed people to understand through this thicket what there was that was available. And then a component of that was maybe creating a blueprint for communities that would give communities like almost a manual of best practices, so that on the ground they could include programs, or at least have a rationalization of types of programs that work. A second one was comprehensive life cycle spouse training. So instead of haphazard kinds of training or getting the same training over and over again, you would never take an Army officer and give him basic weapon training over and over and over again during their career, but that's what we tend to do for spouses. Teach them so that they know how to navigate the system, can reach that stuff themselves. It's kind of like what the USO ideas was talking about. And I'm forgetting what the third one was, but a couple of these are moving forward with some interest from the Senate Armed Services Committee, with some interest from the White House. There's coalitions of groups trying to get these moving forward. And I think we do need to break out of our silos and take pieces of it to make that work. And I think a lot of us are working hard to try to make that happen. The chiefs' wives and are very much part of that too, and I think they're an important voice in all that. All of them expressed, the wives of the chiefs of each of the different services that this inability to reach the programs that already exist is one of their top concerns for current unmet needs.
I have a question. From what I've been hearing, the help for military families comes from a number of sources, and we've been hearing about an incredibly vibrant civil society devoted to military families, and the government is involved, the federal government is involved to some extent. I can see that everybody wishes it would be a little bit more helpful, but nonetheless, it's clearly there. And I'm wondering, since so many needs of society are met by different components of the society, I'm wondering to what extent military families get help, A, from foundations, or B, from localities around military bases. Are local governments also responsive to those needs?
They are. The local communities are honestly the nexus of support for military families. In local chambers of commerce, almost all chambers of commerce have military affairs committees that are deeply involved. Local school boards are deeply involved. And as an organization, we work public engagements in local communities and states. Like next week, we're in Rhode Island, where they develop statewide plans on how they use state resources. This is extremely important under the times now with very constrained budgets. So that people don't lose, focus on helping military families, because there's no reason to reinvent a program, a resource, a source, and say, well, we're going to have it for military families if it's already existing for families in general. So this is where families go, to neighbors, to their communities, and to their schools, and to other types of supports that are there where they live.
It's been very gratifying to see states step up, and I think Purdue is not alone among state-funded universities who have engaged in this effort. A lot of states have enacted legislation to support military families. I see there's a huge consequence of all the Guard and Reserve call-ups during this war, and that has been that community engagement. It used to be, and it happens in terms of Capitol Hill, but it happens at the state and local level. When you're the banker or the sheriff's deputy or the local postman or your kid's second grade teacher is called up to deploy, that's somebody who's heading off, and it's a part of that community. The community embraces that person, that person's family, but what happens is that goodwill and that understanding now, we've got a military family in our midst, and they're having trouble getting somebody to take their TRICARE health care, and they're having other issues, and let's send care packages. But it's translating also into state laws to support military families, whether it's the Interstate Compact to support education transition of children, to funds that are covered by tax donations to provide financial support for military families that are coming out of the state, or unemployment compensation for mobile military spouses, or tuition breaks for National Guard or Reserve members. There's a whole lot of things that have happened at the state and local level, and I think a lot of it has been driven by that immediacy and that awareness of those Guard and Reserve call-ups.
Jennifer?
Thank you, Jennifer Middlestadt. I wanted to go back to this this question that you posed about the gap, and I certainly have no answer to it, but what's interesting is that from a historical perspective, really in the Army anyway, since the mid-'80s, it's just interesting to me that I've heard that again and again. That's not something that's just I'm hearing now, but I've heard over and over again, we create these programs. Of course, there's more now than there used to be, but I've heard about this gap over and over again. And I wonder what you think of this. I have only anecdotal information about this, but in looking at reading a lot of after-action reports that of family support groups and family readiness groups, interviews with officers' wives who run them, ethnographies that have been done on family support groups and things like that. One of the things that comes up, but I never see it dealt with sort of in a thoroughgoing way in the research and in the public discussion on it, is something that I'm not quite sure how to label, but it's sort of a status difference among Army spouses, where spouses may be of E1s through E4s, who are the ones who have a lot. They may be young families. They may have a lot of needs, but they may feel disconnected from their FRG leader, who may be an officer's wife who has greater resources, greater education, who's older, whose family's at a different point in life, and that and then on the other side, it's the FRG leader who's saying, I can't reach those. That's what I keep reading over and over again when I read the Gulf War, for example, the first Gulf War after-action reports. It was impossible to reach those families. We tried to reach out to them. It's really hard to reach them. And they, too, sort of phrased it in a way that had to do maybe with them having different education level, different status, different background, and that I don't know. I'm asking you, are there issues here that have to do with, I don't know what you want to call it, class, age, education, something like that are important here and salient here in explaining the gap between the resources that exist and whether people actually get them?
I think it is a really complicated issue, and I was actually really careful with my choice of words because I said we think there's a gap. And the reason I say we think is that really we know far more about families who can do and will seek services than the families who can't, won't, and don't. So everything we know, or most of what we know about the families who can't, won't, and don't, is speculation from the people who can, do, and will. And so I'm cautious about what I see and what I know. But I'll also point out that it exists, that you'll hear the same thing in the civilian community, where if I were to ask each of you about the programs and policies that are available to you from your employer today as a pop quiz, you would know about 30% of the things that are available to you, because it's a teachable moment. And when you're not at that teachable moment, it doesn't sink in. You don't care about what your employer offers for elder care support until your parent calls and says they broke their hip. Some of you may, but in general, your average employee has a relatively poor idea about what's available to them, and the percentage in the military is actually about the same. But I do think there is a little bit of it's either a class issue, and I think there is an element of class in it. There's also, I think, an institutional issue like you were talking about, which has to do with what I would call institutional and traditional approaches to social service provision. The build it, we'll build it, and they will come. And what you've seen in the last, say, 20 years in terms of trying to change the course of communities that are challenged is that more and more the emphasis has been on going to where the people are, going to them, and locating in places and going out and finding cases as opposed to waiting for them to come in the door. But it is true that officers and their spouses are typically college educated, and enlisted folks and their spouses typically are not. And we know that in the civilian community, education creates a class structure, and that has implications, and I think it does in the military as well. I call it the shadow rank structure. I won't, no. Never mind.
I'd like to just add two things to that. One, the military has no authority over spouses. Right. And so there are a certain number of spouses and spouses' husbands who don't really want the families interacting through official channels. That's one of the reasons we created Blue Star Families, which is a nationwide network of military families of all ranks and services, including Guard and Reserve, so that there's a way, a spouse-to-spouse level, a kind of room of one's own for military families to provide support and share information. There's and we do that with the idea of leading people back to services. We don't want to create a parallel universe. We're certainly not going to create programs, but for being maybe a neighbor or a friend, a safe place to get information that isn't the command. I think that's something that's needed out there. But I will tell you, I'm about as well resourced or capable of a person there is out there as a military spouse in terms of being able to help herself. I went to Bryn Mawr and Princeton for my graduate work. I'm a lawyer. I have friends in important places. I got married later. I had a lot of money in the bank before my husband went away. And it is hard for me. And it is hard for me to find programs, and I feel isolated. If that's how I feel, then I can only imagine how the E3 wife feels. So that is the paradox. There's so much out there, but there is a gap for getting it. And I think those of us, I think the people especially who work closest with the programs and are so impressed and thrilled about what's out there, it's so hard to understand how it is that doesn't trickle down. But I live in Bible Belt, South Carolina, and it really doesn't for some reason. And we got to figure out. I think that we are all involved now in trying to figure that out. And I think in finding new partners and expanding the pie and making it different, going places where we haven't gone, and bringing it to the places where families are, not expecting us to come to them. We're working on a program with the NEA, with Joan Chikawa is here heading up to have art museums around the country this summer open their doors for free to military families to show their appreciation. So wherever, if we can do that kind of thing, so the families don't have to find it, but you can kind of stumble upon it. I think these are some of the ways we can start cutting through, as well as the more official programs that get us there. The things like the pushing and the pulling, the training and the rationalizing.
We have to talk about going where the families are and the families today, where are they? And a lot of us, and I'll admit I've been doing this for a while, and I don't have my finger on the pulse of all the young families, but I hear a lot. And a lot of folks will say, look at all on the installation, and retirees will come home to the military installation. They'll get their prescriptions at the military hospital, and they'll go to the commissary, and they'll go to exchange because they've moved around a lot, and that installation is home. Patterns have changed. As Mary said, 70% of our families live off the installation. Spouses work for civilian employers. Our kids go to civilian schools. We go to civilian houses of worship. For that young spouse, when I hear from the commissary people who are going, why aren't more young families shopping at the commissary? It's such a good deal. They're not coming home, and the retirees are. Well, for that young spouse, their home is Walmart. They've traveled across the country, strange towns, strange everything. They've just gotten married, and they're in this new environment. What's the thing that makes them feel at home? When they see Walmart. Where are they getting a lot of their support? What they're telling me is they're not going to the family center for the Air Force programs, and I'm just picking on you, Eliza, because you're here. They're getting, after work and after getting the kids in bed, they're getting on Facebook at midnight and reconnecting with their high school friends, because that's where their support is. So how...
Going to church on Wednesday night,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how are we... And that's why the discussion about going to where they are and going to the people who interact with them where they are is so important. If we really wanted to help these young military spouses, we'd do that USO training for the Walmart greeters.
Yeah. We spoke to the because we work with the faith community around the country, and speaking to the Virginia Council of Churches. Yeah. And just said, well, just ask the question in the churches across the state is, do you have any children or any families who are connected to military, including the brothers and sisters? And they said, oh, that's a good idea. We hadn't thought about that. But, a lot of people do get their support through, non-traditional ways. And so it is non-traditional in the sense this isn't a sign over the door that says a military family program, but rather how do people connect with each other.
We have time for one more question. Nancy, I think it's appropriate for you to have it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Just a quick question as to if there is any standardized benefit for children in for therapy for kids. Yeah, but always dealing with the issue of distance.
Access.
Yeah, access. Mm-hmm. I would just also ask or just mention, I think self-help is always going to be the issue, especially with increasing internet connectivity and that way of networking. And you may not be siloed that way, but you may have very degraded resources as a result.
Thank you, Nancy. Our time obviously has expired. Just one quick word before we break for the next session. Listening to all of you and listening to the speakers earlier today, it occurs to me that what we need here is a lot more education. I mean, it sounds as if we need ways to educate military families about the kind of help that's out there, and I guess that means to some extent we need to educate ourselves about how to reach them. It sounds as if we need more education of the civilians who work with them and work with talking about the families. It sounds as if we need more education for academia. I say that after a long career in academia, so I'm feeling the pain here too. But most of all, it sounds to me as if we need more education of the public. Somebody said earlier today that the average American doesn't know very much about the military. Well, the average American doesn't know very much about military families. And perhaps conversations of this kind can help to bridge the gap, or perhaps we need to think a little bit more about how to get that information out there. In the name of which, as soon as this panel ends, please stay for a conversation about how we go forward from here, and certainly that can be a major part of it. But before we open the floor up to all of you, please join me in thanking our panel.